My first story happened when I was working part-time in a town called Franschhoek on the Western Cape of South Africa. I was staying at an old boarding house on the outskirts of town. There were 2 houses on the property. The oldest was the main residence that was still in the old Cape Dutch style and was where the owners lived. The other was hired out to boarders. It was not as old, having built in the mid-1800s. The room I stayed in had an old-fashioned wardrobe against the wall, where I kept my clothes. It was very peaceful, with a terrific view of the town from the window. There was a communal bathroom halfway down the opposite passage. One night I had just turned out the bedside light when I saw a figure approaching the foot of my bed. At first I thought it might be one of the other residents, and I switched the light back on again. The moment I did this, the figure seemed to disappear. I put the light out again, and there it was, right in the spot where I had first seen it. Strange as it seems, I felt no fear at the time, and decided to see what would happen next. The figure was definitely female, dressed in what looked like a nightgown. She started to pirouette in front of me, and then fell to the floor. I turned the light on again, and of course there was no one there. "Come on, dude," I chided myself. "You're seeing things." And I fell asleep soon after that. I didn't say anything the next morning, as I was still convinced that it was just a dream, and was, until it happened, almost a week later. Only this time, I noticed a detail that had escaped my attention before. If the figure had been one of the boarders, she would have had to have come through my door, which was directly in front of my bed. Even with the passage light off, I would have noticed it because the bathroom light shone slightly into my room and was always on. The entity came from the side of my room where the wardrobe stood, and on both occasions the cupboard doors were closed. The same sequence of events played out before me, but this time I did not bother putting the light on. I spoke to the owner the next morning, and she told me that my room once had a bathroom attached. It had been removed so that the room next to mine could be built. To my astonishment, I was also informed that the door was just behind the wardrobe. She said she didn't know much about the history of the place, so she couldn't shed any light on what I had seen. Intrigued, I asked around and was finally introduced to an elderly gent who lived in the senior citizens' home. He said that back in the 1940s, the room was occupied by a young girl from Cape Town. She was a ballet dancer, but was forced to stop because she had cancer. It was so bad that the other residents could see her get worse on an almost daily basis. She loved dancing, and even when she was so sick she could hardly stand, she would try a step or two. And one morning, someone found her lying in the middle of the floor. She was dead. Someone said that he was certain that she tried to dance before collapsing. I will leave you to your own opinion of what I saw. My second encounter. A close friend and I began helping people who had been troubled by occurrences that they could not explain. Many of these ended up being more of a counseling session or suggesting that they seek professional or medical help. But there were others that truly were paranormal. By the time this incident occurred, we had gathered quite a large group, with myself and Tom, as well as 2 others being the core. One of them, Mark, was a sensei and a Buddhist. One of the members of his dojo approached him, saying that there was something causing a disturbance in the commune that he was running, and so Mark passed the information on to the rest of the group. Tom and I met with the fellow, who we called Eddie, and discovered that he was an ex-British Marine. He had toured in Afghanistan and Iraq before sustaining a serious injury, that ended his career in the armed forces. He was also a high-ranking member of the local Freemasons' lodge. Having gone through the house, we discovered a hot spot, or rather, cold spot, in the passage next to one bathroom. I set up a barrier of salt around this area to try and contain whatever might be there, and left strict instructions that no one must interfere with it. It consisted of a pentacle with 5 quartz crystals, one at each point, and we agreed to meet again the following day. And Eddie would tell the other occupants to leave the house that night, and only to come back once we had done what needed to be done. The next morning, we were told that Martin, our 4th member, would be late because of car trouble. The 3 of us decided that we would begin without him. The first sign that something was definitely wrong happened just after we arrived. Tom went to the bathroom checking my salt barrier en route, and it was still intact. Mark, Eddie and I were the only other people in the house. When Tom came out, however, the crystals had been removed and were now neatly lined up against a closed door at the opposite end of the passage. I had to reset the barrier. Not long after that, Mark came and told me that the pentacle had been tampered with again. That was when we decided to try and track whatever was doing these things down. We could definitely sense whenever it was near. Just like the spot in the passage, it would suddenly turn cold, as if an icy wind had brushed past it. Tom and Mark headed down the passage that had a bend in it to the left, while Eddie and I waited at the opposite end, near where the salt barrier was. Eddie whispered that he had sensed something, and headed forward to where the turn in the passage was. He was wearing a Kevlar vest. I was tail-end Churley, and suddenly I heard a low grunt, followed by a dull thud next to me, and there was Eddie flat on his back, his face white as a sheet. "What just happened?" I asked. "Something hit me," came the reply. By this time, Tom and Mark had come to see what was going on. We helped Eddie back to his feet and headed to the sitting room. We thought it best to wait until Martin arrived before we continued. Eddie was complaining that his chest was sore. When he removed his flak jacket, to our horror, we could all see what looked like 2 claw marks across from his shoulder to almost the middle of his ribcage. The skin wasn't broken, but there were 2 parallel welts where he had been struck. As I said, this was a hardened, battled Marine, and he was so spooked that he was shaking. He said, "I've dealt with many bad things before, but most of them I could see. This was the first time I was assaulted by something I could not." Martin arrived soon after, and we eventually got rid of whatever it was. But it took a guy with many more years' experience in the paranormal than us in order to succeed. When I was about 2, my grandfather died. I was too young to remember, but I heard stories about how he adored me, and he loved me tirelessly. I'd visit him or he would visit me almost every day. He sometimes refused to let my dad hold or play with me until the visit was over. He loved me very much. After he passed, our dog went nuts. Before we even found out about his passing, our dog Casey became very violent, and my mum was forced to put him down. He was attacking people, and she was afraid for me since I was so little. The dog was also low before it happened. It was really weird. A few days after he passed, my mum put me to bed, cleaned up my room, and put my toys in the closet. The door was closed, and I was in my crib asleep when she left the room. She swears to this day that she heard me babbling from my crib, and it was non-stop. She came back upstairs, and I was somehow sitting on the floor with the closet door wide open staring at it. She asked who I was talking to and I said, "Bampa," and she was very freaked out. When I turned 5, I lost Piggy. He was a stuffed little pig that I'd play with, and I took him everywhere I went. I went to bed with him, woke up with him, and one day when I awoke he was gone, and nobody could find him anywhere. I cried for days, but there was nowhere that he could have gone missing either. It was very strange, and my sister kept telling me that Grandpa took him. And the final piece that I personally remember that still freaks me out. I was 7 and woke up in the middle of the night wanting a glass of water. I didn't want to wake my parents, so I left the lights off, and as I made my way downstairs, I took a hard slip and was about to smash my face against the bottom, when all of a sudden I feel something or someone catch me. It was like floating down the stairs, slowly. When my feet hit the floor at the bottom of the stairs, I snapped back to reality. I know this wasn't a dream because I vividly remember running back up the stairs to try and replicate what happened, and nothing did. I never told anyone for fear of being made fun of and people thinking I'm crazy, but I suspected it was Grandpa. And to top it all off, about 6 months ago I visited my mum, and we got on the subject of my grandpa. I then told her about the stories from the first time, and she went white as a ghost. My sister had similar experiences when we were younger. This was a few years after my story happened, but still, and she did tell my mum. She was also caught and put in a terrace after almost falling down the stairs, floating until safe. I was never aware, and she didn't know my story either. You wouldn't believe any of this, but my family swears by it, and it's the only real paranormal experience I can recall. Thanks, Grandpa Lou, for looking out for us. So my grandparents have had this house since 1974, and have always felt a strange presence in the home, according to what they've told me. I'm 17 years old, and have also always felt a strange presence, like a dark energy in the house, since a very young age. In 2010, my grandparents' son, my uncle, ended his own life in the house. Before he did this though, he had tried to do the same thing in his teen years, and ended up going blind after not being successful. He'd had a rough life, but he seemed like he was always very happy, and my 8-year-old self had no idea what had happened when I found out that he had passed. After that, the house became increasingly more active. Footsteps at night, shadows across walls, and things being misplaced. When we know, we put them somewhere else. Things got bad quickly. This lasted until we had a priest come and bless the house in 2011, and it seemingly stopped. Nothing happened anymore until recently. And then things have gotten strange again. I made a bad mistake and taunted the entities and put my hand on a lamp near me as I was doing it. Sparks flew up from the lamp, and I was pretty terrified, as that's never happened before. Most of my recent experiences were just last week. I was up at around 3 a.m. when everyone was asleep. I was on the family computer trying to get work done when I heard 3 or 4 loud footsteps and turned to where the noise was coming from and saw a shadow figure moving across the wall. I checked from where it came from and no one was there. Everyone was asleep in the house except me. I was obviously freaked out a little, but continued on doing work because it didn't bother me too much. My grandmother is absolutely certain something is watching her at night, and she claims she heard a growl when she was in the kitchen one time late at night. My grandfather dismisses everything she says and always tries to come up with a natural explanation for it. Here I am today, just wanting to know other people's opinion. on what you think of my creepy situation. When I was 16, I would jump on my trampoline out back for hours every night. Literally hours. I would listen to my iPod and just daydream to get away from a rough family life. One night when I was jumping, a kid ran past our fence at full speed carrying a box about the size and shape of a skateboard. He ran to the park behind my house and held it by the edge and tossed it into the air, so that it flipped a few times before landing on the ground. At this point I was a little weirded out, because he was just standing over it staring for a pretty long time. Then out of nowhere, he just bolts full speed back past our fence like he didn't even notice I was there. Alright, that's a bit weird. I just kept jumping and staring at where the box was. Here's where it gets creepy. The box looked like it was moving. Then something started to rise out of it. I actually stopped jumping and rubbed my eyes and watched as it looked like a fully grown man rose out of the box that was 2 inches thick. He had an elongated head with no hair. His skin was orange and his eyes were huge and pitch black. He raised one arm up to his side, and the box just kind of went into what I can only describe as a trench coat. He walked over to the only pavilion we have at the small park, grabbed the metal beam holding up the overhang, and began to bang his head onto the beam over and over. At this point I rubbed my eyes a few times and couldn't even move. I had no idea what I was seeing. Then without warning, he just stopped, and his head quickly whipped around and stared at me. It was like he could feel me watching him. A giant, and I mean a giant smile came across his face, and those dark eyes just stared at me. He tilted his head back and forth a few times, and I had goosebumps and my eyes began tearing up. Even typing this makes my hair stand on edge, because I'll never forget that look. As I was about to start crying, he turned around and kind of phased down the road into the distance. He was gone. That was it. I bawled my eyes out and sprinted inside and called my best friend, who assured me I was just seeing things and needed to calm down. I'm sure I sound insane and no one will believe me, but that is the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me. My brother and I shared a very old house here in a small mountain town in Colorado. Sadly though, my brother has since passed. The entire house was severely out of date and drab. It was an odd layout, and the basement, well, that's a whole different story. But the whole house seemed to vibrate with dark vibes and energy. The lamps and overhead lights never seemed to brighten the rooms enough to make you feel comfortable. I've had many friends and a few boyfriends comment on the creepy presence of the outside and the physical difference the house gave off when you were inside it. I have had countless, seemingly unexplained happenings that could go on all night, but for now, this is the creepiest. My brother passed away in the house in 2011. His girlfriend in 2009, and 2 dogs died in the house before I finally moved out. This story is about my brother's first dog, Duke, who passed away first. He was an elderly black mixed dog, sweet as could be, and always on my side. The other dog was Gunner, a black lab that was much younger than Duke. Well, the day came that Duke died of old age. He walked into my room with his swollen tongue and dropped to the floor and took his last struggling breaths in my bedroom. We were all very sad, of course, and life went on. My brother's bedroom and mine were right next to each other at the end of a long hallway, with a bathroom to the side of the kitchen and living room at the end of the hallway. One night, I came out of bed, opened my door into the dark hallway, and proceeded down the long hallway to the kitchen. Gunner usually sits at my brother's doorframe to keep an observing eye on my brother and myself and the happenings of the house. So when I started down the hallway into the dark, I heard and felt Gunner trot down the hallway from behind me, swipe my seat pant leg as he trotted by, and I heard him make his way to the kitchen. I get to the light switch at the end of the hall, and to my surprise, there is Gunner completely passed out on the couch under a blanket. That was not the Gunner who ran past me, and it still gives me chills remembering this story. Two years after my dad had passed away, I was living in Oregon for the first time and decided to take a day trip to see the Painted Hills. But this trip was further than I had planned, and being in the dead of winter, the weather was horrible. Freezing fog made visibility near zero, and I headed back towards Portland, and rather than risking hitting snow in the mountains, I veered north through the desert. Unfortunately, conditions in the desert were the same. I couldn't see a thing. There were no other cars on the highway, and in stretches where there were no reflectors, I'd find myself drifting far off the road. To make matters worse, I hadn't slept well the night before, and was starting to fall asleep at the wheel. My CD player wasn't working, and there had been no radio for an hour. Just static, fog, and darkness, lulling me into deadly delirium. Me crashing my car had pretty much been my dad's worst nightmare. It was the thing we talked about most when it came to safety. I will also mention here that my dad loved the band Chicago, which we gave him a lot of grief for. Because suddenly in the middle of nowhere, the radio signal came back, which is good because my eyes were closed and I was off the road asleep. I was awoken to the sound of voices. A song. The lyrics went, "You're the meaning in my life. You're my inspiration." And I felt like my dad was with me. I rolled down the window so the freezing air could keep me awake, and I turned up the radio as loud as I could and shouted that song all the way through. I started crying. The song ended and the signal faded back to static. I know how unlikely that sounds, but it happened that way. I might have just been driving back behind some hills and lost signal rapidly, but it happened right when the song ended, and I didn't even hear a radio call sign. I made it back home safely. I don't pretend to draw any certain conclusions about what happened. I just know the music came on in time to save my life before I left the road completely. Senior year of college. My best friend Emma and I are living together in an apartment. Just us two in a 2-bedroom. One day, the key to our mailbox that she swears she remembers putting at our table by the door disappears. She had an important piece of mail coming later, so she'd placed it there specifically so that she could run out of the mailbox when she got home from class. We searched the house after and looked everywhere, and finally after a few weeks we decided that one of us must have lost it, and we finally had to ask our landlord for a new one. It was just an annoying household mystery until one night a few months later. Emma is a super spiritual person, claiming she can feel presences and stuff like that. Personally, I thought it was bull. For example, she has always claimed that when she passes under a streetlight in her car, it flickers off while she's below it, and comes back on when she's looking at it in her rearview mirror. I can always tell how dumb that sounds, but she's below the light so you can see it. She was driving home one night along a long street, and the streetlight phenomenon kept happening to her. She arrived at our place and immediately mentioned the streetlight thing was in full force, and she felt like she had a presence with her. I literally said out loud, "Why would a ghost be able to change the lights, Emma?" Right as I said that, the lights in our apartment went out for 10 seconds and turned back on. Needless to say, we were both scared, and we freaked out for a while and finally calmed down. I turn on a Spotify playlist, and we settled in for the evening, chatting over glasses of wine. About 10 minutes after the light incident happened, the speaker starts playing static in the middle of a song. I'd never heard this speaker have this kind of problem before, and hasn't had it since. I rushed over to turn the speaker off, but the static stopped abruptly, and my phone randomly put on a different song from my playlist. Before I reached the speaker, I had chills again. The new song was called Ghosts. We finally calmed down enough to go to bed and wake up the next morning. A friend of ours comes over and we're making a little brunch. My friend is throwing cinnamon rolls in the oven and asks us, "Why is there a key in your oven?" The mysteriously vanishing male key was literally balanced across the rack in the oven. Not on the bottom of the oven. This tiny key was sitting on 2 wires in the oven perfectly. Literally, there's no way it could have just fallen and landed in there like that. It had to have been put in there purposely by someone. We moved out about a month later, but there were no more surprises. I'm still a huge skeptic, but even I have to admit that I can't explain the events of that night and morning. About 2 years ago, my friends and I visited Letchworth Village in Rockland County, New York. It was a psychiatric hospital for the mentally and physically disabled, opened in 1911, and was the site of the first polio vaccine trials in the United States. Letchworth was finally shut down in the 90s because of the rampant abuse and mistreatment of the live-in patients, but many of the hospital's abandoned buildings are still standing on campus, and most are decayed enough or already broken into to be easily accessible. The final building we explored was once the main hospital. My friend mentioned that this place was apparently featured on some ghost hunters type show, one of the most haunted places in America, or something like that. And we were pretty excited when we saw that someone had graffitied on the walls, "The ghosts are here." The first room had rusted metal bars suspended by wires hanging from the ceiling. This in itself was not out of the ordinary, but as we entered, a gust of wind shook the bars, which began to swing and clank eerily against each other. Needless to say, it was a nice spooky entrance. Upon entering that tetanus trap, we entered a long hallway with a big staircase leading to the basement and the second floor. Ignoring every single horror film infused instinct to not go down the flight of foreboding stairs into what could very well be the gates of hell, we climbed down to the basement, which of course was extremely dark, save for a welcoming burst of light streaming in from a broken window near the stairs. With our flashlights on, we made our way slowly through the basement hall, and at about halfway we found the old morgue. One of my photographer friends had set up his tripod and began taking a long exposure of the morgue as the rest of us waited and jokingly tried to convince him to climb inside of it. As this was taking place, I happened to look back down the hall from where we came. I couldn't make out any details of the hallway except for the beam of light at the other end. It looked like there was something partially blocking the beam of light coming in from the broken window. Kind of like a shadow, but more like a silhouette, where a person's upper torso and head would have been illuminated by the light, instead of just darkness. However, the second I noticed it, it moved, and the beam of light was undisturbed once again. Right around that time, my fight or flight instinct kicked in, and my bowels went a little loose at the sound of footsteps that came clearly from behind the doors of the unexplored room ahead of us. I can't remember if I screamed, cried, or a little bit of both, but we left there pretty quickly after that. I'm from Texas and was planning on moving to Ohio to live with my mum. But before I moved, she told me that when she was in the house one time by herself at midday, that she heard a growl come from upstairs. She said she ran upstairs yelling and checking all the rooms. I honestly thought she was joking, but about a month later I moved in and started school. So there were times I was home by myself and everything was just normal. I hadn't heard anything, so I started to think she was just full of it and scared because she was by herself with the accompaniment of her boyfriend every now and then. I just finished a study sesh at the library at around 7:30, and my mum said she was working late. By the time I got home it was 7:45, and during winter the sun was already set. I went inside. Only the kitchen light was on, and I began eating a snack while leaning against the counter. I looked towards the dining room where it was dark and started to feel uneasy. So I went to go turn on the light as I was walking back, and I passed the stairs, and it sounded like someone was running down them. So I assumed it was the neighbors or the house settling. Then I started walking past the couch and heard heavy breathing, like if someone literally just got through running a marathon. I decide to ignore it and go back to the kitchen to finish my snack. As soon as I lean against the counter, something growled at me from the other side of the wall. I stopped what I was doing, and I was slightly peeking around the corner, and it growled at me again, but louder this time. I ran out to my car and sat in it watching the house for the next 2 hours until my mum came home. I told her what happened, and she believed me, but her boyfriend just laughed to my face. It's been a good 7 months, and we've heard the growl twice since then, and have felt an awfully dark energy towards the area of the dining and living room. So my family has always had something around in every house we lived in. So this house, the one we're currently in, has had some strange occurrences. Our beds would shake like a mini earthquake. My dad said he saw a predator camouflage outline in the trees watching us while checking what my dog was barking at. And we've had them choke us in the night. My sister used to crash in our living room when visiting from school. At this time I was unemployed and staying up until 4 a.m. every night playing video games. One night, I heard a loud gurgling, so I went to check it out with my dog, and my sister had tears in her eyes. She looked at me and points at the light, so I flick the switch, and she sits up gasping for air. I ask her what was wrong, and she didn't say a thing. She finally asked if she could use my bed, and I let her solely for being able to use the larger living room TV for myself. A few months later, I took a nap on the same couch at around 7, but woke up 15 minutes later to see 2 large glowing circles, eyes, red around the edges, yellow in the middle, and staring at me. I feel something pull me to the armrest, not fully being enough to realize I'm in some serious unexplainable stuff, and could not speak, let alone scream for help. My right arm was slightly lifted, like it was putting me in a goddamn supernatural sleeper hold. But I had my phone in my left pocket and dialed my sister's number. I hear her voice and I start flicking the phone, tapping it until I see the hallway light turn on. She runs over and sees me tearing up and screams, "Stop!" at the top of her lungs. And I could finally breathe. We haven't slept in that room since, but I'm still interested in knowing what it was and why it was choking us. My mum had a cat for 15 years before she had to put it down. The first pet she got after she and my dad got together. He'd cuddle, nurse on your neck, and talk to you. Really one of those forever kitten types. Every now and again, she'd still dream about him. Little peaceful dreams where he'd usually do nothing more than sit on her lap, purring or kneading. Sometimes, when we were on the phone, my mum would say, "Sugar visited me again last night," in a nostalgic sort of way. I always kind of patronized her, until a very close friend of mine passed away due to brain cancer. He'd visit me in my dreams, talk to me, and do silly stuff like we always used to do together. One time, I got this kid to take swigs of gin, followed by bites from a block of cheddar. One time, I realized an entire road trip I'd taken on bus with him was just me traveling alone talking to myself. That was very cruel of him, to just disappear like that. I'm a writer, so although I don't necessarily believe in ghosts, I wrote to him in a journal he gave me for my birthday. I asked him to please stop visiting me. It was too much. It hurt. And just leaving me like that was like losing him all over again. The next night he came to see me one last time. He put his arm around me and said, It's okay, I understand." And with that goofy, sad smile on his face, I cried on my shoulder and let myself feel the relief of saying goodbye. And I haven't seen him since. I worked in a really old movie theater for my first job. It was a small theater with 6 screens and all in a line, so you could see from one end of the building to the other. Eventually, I got promoted to a manager, so I had to start the movies. We had film still, so it was fairly complicated. You had to thread the projector and then watch over them because they mess up easily. We always joked about ghosts and a lot of weird stuff happening around there, like falling over, doors shutting and hearing voices. Well, one day I was there with one employee, slow midweek day, and I walked out of the office up to the projection booth and out of habit looked both ways. You know, the old left-right? To my right there was a woman in a whitish dress with brown hair, about 4 feet away just standing. I only caught a glimpse of her before doing a double take and she was gone. I wasn't the only person to see her. Several other employees claimed they've seen a similar woman around the theater. I never saw her again though. More silly stuff happened, like doors locking behind you, or things that were on tables ending up on the floor. Our projectors were old film projectors, and more than a few times one of us would forget to start a movie on time, only to find it had been already started for us. Another manager claimed that she saw the ghost woman who was called Sarah in the window upstairs when she was leaving for the night. One time we were watching a movie after hours, and we heard a series of what sounded like tin cans fall in succession around the theatre walls. There were some rumours that Sarah was a projectionist at an old theatre elsewhere, who somehow ended up buried in its walls, and pieces of the building were used in the construction of ours. But we never found any evidence to back up this urban legend. My family and I had just rented this beautiful historical house that was built around the Underground Railroad era. It had small hideouts and doors where slaves would hide in, and as soon as we moved it, we got uncomfortable vibes from it. We'd hear footsteps coming from the upstairs when everyone was downstairs. The TV would turn on and off by itself, and doors would open and close by themselves. We eventually accepted the fact that we had a ghost, and it seemed harmless. So we called her Claudia. Each of my family members had at least seen Claudia once. She was a tall, dark figure who could move fast. Most of the hauntings would come from my bedroom, and it was always cold and had an unpleasant smell. My little brother began sleepwalking and would have terrible nightmares. One night became the final straw for my family and our relationship with Claudia. My sister and I were away at a friend's house, while my parents and brother were at home. The whole house was asleep when my dad woke up from screaming coming from my bedroom. When he ran out past the living room where my little brother liked to sleep because of his sleepwalking, he noticed that my brother wasn't there. So he ran upstairs where he met my older brother, who had heard the screaming as well, and they saw that my bedroom door was shut and that my little brother was screaming in the room. They both went to open the door, but it was like something was blocking it. And when my dad could finally bust through the door, a black shadow ran right past him and my brother. He entered the room, and it was freezing. He could even see his own breath. He looked over at my little brother, who was laying on my bed covered in sweat and tears, and started yelling his name to wake him up. But my little brother pointed, still asleep, at the corner of the room and started yelling, "Get her, Daddy, get her." My dad looked over but saw nothing but pitch black. That was enough for him. He quickly grabbed my brother, who was stiff as a board, and ran the hell out of there. When my brother woke up the next day, he had no recollection of what happened that night, and still doesn't remember when he talked about it almost 5 years later. We moved out of that house a few weeks after the incident, and my brother stopped sleepwalking as soon as we did. We've heard other stories from the people who currently own the house, but nothing quite as terrifying as what happened to my brother or dad. The house has a great history behind it, but it was just too creepy for my family. I worked in a movie theater when I was 17. On my first day, everyone was joking around about how the theater was haunted and trying to scare me. Sometime during this, the manager at the time goes upstairs to talk on the phone with her fiancé, as it's a really chilled out workplace. Our theater had 4 screens and a long, dark hallway. There was a dark room with 4 old school projectors, and she was sitting on a desk that we used whenever a movie would inevitably mess up and the film would break. This desk was between projectors 2 and 3 on the opposite wall. About 5 minutes later, as we're all standing in concessions goofing off, we hear her running down the stairs. We turn to see why she's running, and she has this confused and angry sort of look on her face and asked us who went upstairs. At this point we were all confused, since nobody had left concessions at all, and she says she was chatting with her fiancé when she saw something out of the corner of her eye. She turns and sees the calves/feet of someone wearing blue jeans and white tennis shoes crawl behind projector 4, directly in front of the stairs. She told her fiancé she thought one of us was trying to scare her, so she walked over to find no one. The only people wearing jeans were myself, since I didn't have my khakis yet, and another guy I had been talking to the whole time this took place. Still gives me the chills, and lots of weird stuff has happened there. I am from Morocco. Moroccans think that jinns must be living in the land of the jinns because of the numerous incidences and encounters and real witchcraft stuff that happens here. Almost everyone in Morocco has at least 10 stories to share. I have a few as well, from watching possessed people speaking different languages to getting to see an entity with my own eyes. This one happened a few months ago. One night I was awake watching movies at 4 a.m. when my brother started knocking on the door like crazy. I opened the door and he was gasping. He went straight to the window and looked through, trying to see if anyone was there. It took a while for him to calm down and tell me what happened. He was walking home and it was late, so the streets were empty and quiet. He tried to take a shortcut by going through this alley, so by the time he got there, he saw something in the alley. He told me that there was this old man in white, with long white hair and a long white beard in white clothes. It kind of reminded me of Gandalf, but anyway. This man was actually frozen. He was standing in the middle of the alley looking up and not moving at all at 4 a.m. My brother stopped and stared at a distance, and suddenly this guy turned his head so fast and stared back at my brother, and he had no facial expressions when he began running towards him. He was running so fast, it was impossible for a man his age. My brother fled and didn't stop running nor looking back until he got home. When I was 12, my dog Lizzie, who was probably 12 as well at the time, became very sick. We took her to the vet and found out she had an aggressive tumor in her abdominal area that was quickly growing. She was having strokes, vomiting, and she was very fatigued. My mum let me miss school the next day if I wanted to, but I chose to go in order to get my mind off things, and so did my little brother. My older sister decided to stay home with my mum, and we all got in the car that morning with Lizzie, and she sat in the front of my sister's lap. After I got out the car at school, I started walking over to the window where she was sitting and gave her a kiss goodbye, because I didn't know if I'd get to see her again. I couldn't stop thinking of her all day. At around noon, right after lunch, I was in my maths class. I was sitting at my desk taking notes as my teacher gave her lesson as usual, and out of the blue, I felt what I can only describe as a punch to my heart, and I knew Lizzie was gone. I could almost feel her cuddling me in my lap one last time before she left. It was like she'd come to say goodbye. I came home later that day to find my mum and sister gave Lizzie the best last day a dog could have, and took her to the vet where she was put to sleep, which happened around noon. I knew it sounds cheesy, but that's the most paranormal thing I've ever personally experienced. Lizzie got sick so suddenly that we could hardly believe it. So treat every day with your animals for granted. You never know when it will be the last time you get to see them. I used to live in a building that was rumored to be haunted. It was a 5-story walk-up with 2 apartments on each floor. I lived in one of the apartments at the top floor, but only ever had small incidents that I thought were fairly explainable. I had a cat who'd I'd cared for since he was 2 months old, and by that time, he was 16 and dying of cancer. The vet was really nice and came over to put him to sleep so he wouldn't have to go to the clinic. The night after he died, I woke up at 2 in the morning and could hear sounds like furniture being moved down the stairs, and thought someone was stealing the patio furniture that my neighbor and I kept on the roof. I ran out of bed, but when I opened the door there was no one there, but I could still hear the scraping and moving. I would have thought it was just a dream, but my neighbor came out of the apartment too and started crying out of fear. She also wanted to call the cops, but in the end decided they wouldn't take her seriously anyway. I went back to bed, but woke up around dawn and felt the spirit of my recently deceased cat jump up to the bed and climb up my leg and sit on my chest purring, exactly like he used to every day. I was fully awake, and he jumped off the bed and I felt his presence disappear. Even if this was some kind of complex hallucination, I'm really glad I had it, because I loved that cat. When I was a toddler, my mum tried to save an old woman's life after a car crash, but couldn't. The lady was bleeding out of the side of her head pretty bad and passed away before the ambulance arrived. The next day, my twin brother and I were in the car with our mum when my brother said that there was a grandma sitting in the passenger seat. I piped in and said that she had a boo-boo in her ear, and we told Mum that she wanted to go to the hospital. My mother, superstitious as she was, drove all the way to the hospital and dropped off the old lady there. Mum ended up staying at our grandma's for a week after that. My brother and I always played a game with our mum when she would ask us who was riding in the passenger seat with us on our way to daycare or wherever else. We'd usually say Spider-Man or some cartoon character, but that day was different. When our mum pulled up to the hospital, we told her that the old lady was asking my mum to walk her to the entrance. Once my mum opened the door, walked slowly to the entrance and opened the hospital door and walked back to the car, we both told her that the lady said thank you. My mum was never in the accident, by the way. She just came across the scene, as that's the kind of woman she is. She tried to help however she could. She's always just been very in touch with the paranormal. When I was 15, my family went for a trip to a hill station named Shimla in India. We booked a suite in a hotel in which the master bedroom had a glass platform of about 8 by 8 sticking about 2 feet outside the room over the valleys, which were hundreds of feet below us. Being an adventurous kid, I slept on that platform, the one that overlooked the hills and valleys. My dad slept on a bed, and my mother and sister in the other bedroom. It was around 1:30 at night. I was sleeping on my side facing the glass, which was around 3 inches from my face, and suddenly I opened my eyes to see a woman looking at me intently from the other side. I still remember her face was totally pale, her eyes dark, with black hair and a type of dark cloth on the body. I can only explain her gaze as of a lion before it jumps to kill its prey. It took me 3 to 4 seconds to realize where I was, and that this is not some human looking through a window, but some entity floating outside my room. I shouted as loud as I could and pushed myself back so hard from the glass, I ended up hitting the other end of the room by force. My dad woke up, turned all the lights on, but there was no one to be seen. That was the last time I ever slept with my window shades open in life. It's been 8 years since, but the incident and those terrifying eyes I will never forget. When I was in high school, the days before cell phones were common, my friends were to come over to pick me up from my house one night. We had made plans at school for them to pick me up at 7 p.m. At 6, my parents had said to come with them to do something, and I totally forgot to call my friends to tell them. They came to my house at 7 and called the house phone with no answer. There were 4 of them in the car, and they all told us the exact same story. They said that they were about to pull out of my driveway, but they saw someone peek through the blinds from the bedroom on the top right. That was my room, so they assumed I was messing around. 5 more times, they said that someone would peek through the blinds, and a few times they even saw the person's eyes. We got home at 7:10 to 7:15, and they were still on our driveway. One of my friends came over and said they thought that I was messing with them. They then asked me, "So who's staying in your room?" I told them no one. "So who's home in your house right now?" "No one." Their stone-cold faces told me that they had seen something. At first, we all thought there was a burglar, so we called the cops. They came and inspected the house. There were zero signs of a break-in. Nothing was touched, nothing was stolen, and our house had an alarm on it, so there's no way someone could have come into the house without setting it off. My friends, my family, and the cops all kind of stood around for a few minutes, trying to make sense of the situation. My friends swore up and down, and still do, that they couldn't have imagined what they saw. All four of them saw the same things, and it wasn't a particularly dark night, so their eyes couldn't have been playing tricks on them. To this day, none of us can make sense of that situation. I have two stories, both when feeding neighbors' cats while they were on vacation. The first one is from the neighbor on the left. I was going to her cat's litter box, which was through a hallway, and I felt someone grab my shoulder hard and pull me back towards them. I was almost lifted off my feet, it was so strong. My mum was rooms away, and later we had that neighbor over for Christmas, and she told us that she thinks her mother and father's spirits were still in the house, and that they call her name sometimes. The second is the neighbor to the right. I was with another neighbor/friend, and we were about 14-ish. I wasn't the one getting paid, but it just was fun. The neighbor had 4 cats, and I was with 3 of them, and all of a sudden I heard my name. I thought it was my friend calling me, but she said it wasn't. And after she came and hung out with me on the couch, a minute later, 2 of the cat's hairs stand straight on their backs, and they ran into the bathroom and laid in the bathtub. Then I heard my name much louder. I left, and when I got home I told my parents, and they just kind of look at me. Turns out when I was a baby at about 2, before the other neighbors moved in, there was an older lady who lived there and used to love to play with me. She OD'd and fell asleep in the bathtub, and I do not cat sit anymore. My dad's house, before it burnt down in late January of this year, was well known in my family for being haunted. We actually had people come over, sometimes called ghost hunters, and inspect the house. From what they found, and from personal experience, there were 2 children on the first floor, a boy and a girl around the ages of 6 to 9. A man and a woman upstairs, assumed to be a husband and wife, and a man downstairs. The 2 children were shy, but they still liked to play. We mostly saw the boy, as he would peek around the corner of the kitchen when my mum was doing dishes, and then hide again when she looked over at him. He liked hide and seek. I would be alone in the house, and find all of the kitchen cabinet doors open very frequently. My mum told me that one time, when my dad had left for work, and I had just left for school, that I had left the TV on when I left, and that she heard a laugh coming from the living room. Thinking it was me, she looked into the room and saw nobody. My stepmom also mentioned that the dogs frequently barked at something at the top of the stairs, and that she would often see a woman standing on the top step. I have so many other experiences. It was certainly a scary place. This is my friend's story. Her dad ended his own life when he was in college. Her uncle, her dad's brother, and her dad were in a huge fight, to the point of not speaking to each other. The uncle felt super guilty about being on bad terms when his brother did that. Fast forward to a few months later. It was 3 a.m. and her uncle got a phone call from a random number. He realized after a few moments that it was his brother's old cell phone number, and he immediately called the number back. A very groggy woman answered the other line. He tells her that she just called him, and she swears up and down that she did not. She even checked her recent calls, and the uncle's number didn't show. They were both pretty freaked out, but they hung up. Fast forward a few months later, the same thing happens. This time the uncle doesn't call her back. He just decides to go to the next day to the AT&T to block the number from calling him. So the next day he goes in and tells them the story. The employee all of a sudden gets really quiet and sort of pale, and proceeds to tell my uncle that a few months ago, when the first phone call happened, the woman was so scared by his story she asked for a different phone number. The phone number now belongs to no one and had been disconnected for months. They think that it was my dad's way of telling his brother that he forgave him. They still have no explanation as to why the number called my uncle in the first place, though. Me and my mother were in the same dream. Sort of. You see, in my dream, I saw my deceased grandmother, and she and I were talking at a room in our house located on the second floor. I can't remember what exactly we were talking about, but I remember I was asking for forgiveness for something. I sense that there are other relatives waiting outside the door, as if they're lining up to talk to my grandmother also. But it was not a sad mood. It felt festive, in fact, like one of her parties, as she loved to entertain when she was alive. I remember that I recognized people at the party, old relatives like my grandmother that were already dead. I didn't tell my mum about it because she's superstitious and all, and she likes to make a big deal out of these things. But 2 days later, as we were eating breakfast, she told me that she dreamt of her mother-in-law, my grandmother, and here's where the part gets weird. In her dream, she was outside of her house, and she knew that there was a gathering inside, like a party. She caught a glimpse of my grandmother and our dead relatives at the gathering. She knew there was a party inside, and she refused to enter the house, thinking in her dream that she didn't belong there. If she had decided to come in, would she have found me inside? It creeped both of us out. The coincidence was uncanny. It wasn't as if we talked about my grandmother in recent times that might have triggered the dream. What's more creepy was that she didn't even know about my dream, and yet in 2 consecutive nights, we managed to dream about the almost same event. One time, I drove back to college after Christmas, but before the winter break was over, so I was the first of my roommates to get back to the house we were renting. Our house was in a pretty isolated spot on the outskirts of a town in upstate New York. I pulled into the driveway behind the house and went to the trunk and grabbed one of my bags and then ran inside, because I had to use the bathroom badly, as I'd been on the road for 5 hours. I was inside the house using the bathroom for about 5 minutes, and after I went back outside to get the rest of my stuff from the car, there were footprints in the snow all around it. Now, as I said, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. The only set of footprints should have been mine from where I'd gotten out of the car on the driver's side and walked to the trunk, and then walked to the back door. Yet now, there was another set of footprints circling the car, and then leading into the woods at the back of the property. It appeared that the footprints had originally come from the woods as well. I had left my trunk open when I was inside, because I assumed I was alone, and nothing had been taken. But someone had seen me arrive, come out of the woods, circled my car, and gone back in. I grabbed the rest of my stuff, locked my car, ran into the house, and locked the doors. I used to have a penchant for wandering around abandoned buildings when I was in high school. One time a friend and I decided it would be a good idea to explore a farmstead that hadn't been in use for years. The whole experience was really bizarre. The farmstead was accessible by a long gravel road that brought you to a cluster of dilapidated buildings around a central barn. We parked at the end of a gravel road and turned off to the main road so that we could walk around the property and just pull out quickly later. We went into the barn first, and there were deer bones arranged in a circle around the skull, and a bunch of blankets and wood stacked in a corner of the room. We thought it was really cultish and weird, and noped out of there and began making our way back to the car. Halfway down the gravel road we heard crunching, heavy footsteps, and someone screeching behind us, a blood-curdling scream. We sprinted back to my car and tried to peel out of there as fast as possible, but it had snowed the night prior, and my back tire was stuck in a puddle of melted snow. My friend was screaming because she was freaked out and wouldn't turn to look at the path behind us. By the time I had gotten the car unstuck, she turned around to see if there was something following us, but there was nothing there. It could have been a bird or something, but we both swear up and down to this day that something was following us. I actually thought I was going to die that day. This happened twice to me, both of which occurred when I was about 4 or 5 years old. The first time I was laying in bed with the lights on, about to go to sleep. The door closed, blinds closed, and my bedroom is on the second floor of your typical house. Right beside the bed, I saw the shadow of a man creeping silently. I stared at it for 5 to 10 seconds until it mysteriously vanished through the wall. No one was in my bedroom but me. And I should mention, I wasn't scared or had any negative feelings of this presence. The second time was much the same, but I was on top of my stairs playing with action figures as I heard a noise. I looked down the stairs, and the same type of shadow man was creeping through the hallway. Only my mum and I were home at the time, and my mum was asleep in her room, which was at the top of the stairs. The way the angle was, and how the stairs are situated, it could have been anyone walking near the stairs, like a burglar. Once again, I wasn't scared of this presence. I just didn't understand what it was or what it meant. I just knew it wasn't the ordinary, and definitely wasn't human. I lived in this house for a good 20 more years, and never witnessed anything again. Just random acts where my dogs would bark at nothing. In 2016, we had to put down my cat, who was 16 years old. He lived a good life and was a very loving cat. In the middle of the night, I would often hear him walking down the hallway, calling out for someone, and as I was always the one to go comfort and cuddle him to reassure him that we were there, he would sleep next to my bed. I had a good connection with him. The night we put him down, I cried my heart out before I went to sleep. I heard him walk down the hallway one last time as he called out. I opened the door and saw him, and he purred, then walked away, and I didn't sleep that night. Earlier in the year, we had to give my dog to my grandmother, who lived 6 hours away from us. It hurt me to see him go, as I was always the one to protect him and comfort him when he broke his paw, and he would sleep in my room. He would always come to comfort me, because he was scared of my cats. And after a month, when he was with my grandmother, I had a dream of him, that he was on my lap, licked my hand, and then went to sleep, and I woke up. The next morning, my family sat me down and told me the news, that he had died from liver failure that night. 2016 was not a good year. My friend asked me if I would go to her house after work to feed her dog, as she would not be able to make it until 3 a.m. as she worked in a bar. I get to her house at 8:30 p.m. I have the key she left under the mat, unlock the door, and once I'm in I turn off the alarm and put the key in a white bowl by the door, and I'm 100% sure that's where I put it. I feed the dog, play with him for a little while, and when I went to lock up the house again, the key was gone. Just then the dog started furiously barking and ran full speed out of the kitchen and up the stairs. He just sat there growling at nothing. The feeling that eventually came over me at the time was so strange. I randomly burst out crying and couldn't stop. Eventually I calmed down, put the dog back in the kitchen, and looked for the key. It was literally nowhere. I ended up finding another key that worked, so I just locked the house and left. I told my friend, and she looked for a week, but couldn't find it. Then one day, the key was back in the white bowl. This is circa 2001 to 2003, in Morgantown, Indiana, at a place called Auntie M's Tea Room, which sadly no longer exists. On 3 separate occasions while cleaning up after closing time, I heard what sounded like a small child crying. It was soft, and every time I tried to walk towards the sound, it seemed to grow further away, or at least move to a different part of the restaurant altogether. It was unnerving to say the least. A friend of mine worked there with me, and once after hours she heard me call her name from inside the stockroom, and at the time I heard her call her name from the front of the restaurant. We ran into each other on our way to answer the calls. We were both very confused when we realized neither of us had actually called each other. Lastly, and most chillingly, 2 people I knew passed away very shortly after eating at Auntie M's, and I was the person that served them their last meals on both occasions. One passed in an accident, and the other of a heart attack. Was it just their time to go? I don't know. But it really creeped me out that in that restaurant, I've served 2 people their last meals on Earth. A year before my son was born, my boyfriend's father died. I'd never met him before, but heard stories of his twisted sense of humor and how he liked to mess with people. My boyfriend wasn't particularly close to his dad. We lived together in North Carolina, and his dad had taken off to Seattle when my boyfriend was young. I don't think my boyfriend really grieved until our son was born, and he realized that his dad would never meet him. That hit him hard. Over the first month of caring for our newborn, we started to notice screws that had fallen out of household items. Kitchen chairs, towel racks, screen doors, outlet covers. The most random stuff. More than a dozen loose screws in the span of a week. Kind of weird, but we were sleep-deprived parents and didn't really have the mental stamina to waste trying to figure it out. One day we were chilling in the living room, and a screw falls out of the light fixture and lands in my boyfriend's lap. He starts laughing hysterically so hard he can't breathe. When he finally calms down, he tells me what set him off, and he holds the screw up and said, "I finally get it. My dad is screwing with me." We never had a loose screw since. I got my dog when I was 12, and she was 6. She was the best dog I will ever own. She passed away in 2013. I miss her every day, and cannot talk about her without crying. Even this is making me tear up a little bit. Every once in a while I'll dream about her, and she will always just sit on my lap and I will pet her. Everything around me feels so foggy but her and I. It feels so real. I can feel her hair and hear her snoring, as she was a pug mix. When I was 15, I tried to end my own life by taking pills, and she kept barking and barking and barking. I made myself throw them up and apologized to her and cried. I tried again with a razor when I was 19, and she didn't stop barking until I stopped and held her, and I tried again last May. It was very surreal. I planned on jumping into the river, and I've never shared this with anyone, by the way. When I got out of my car, I swear I heard her barking. My feet were so incredibly heavy, and I went up to the river anyway. It was full of police and boats because someone had fallen in the night before, and they were looking for his body. I went home, and I'm doing much better now, but I haven't had a dream visit from her since that night. She sat in my lap again, and I woke up crying but feeling calm. I really do miss her. About 4 years ago, we heard my grandmother fell and hit her head and wasn't going to make it. We drove 4 hours south to get to see her one last time. My mum was distraught. She was riding back with some other family. My sister had to drive us home. We were pulling off on the side road, and I can't remember what we were doing over there, but we were waiting for cars to pass so that we could do a U-turn. I turn around and look to see a car approaching. My sister then says, "I'm gonna hit this car." I thought she was messing around or something. Then as the car starts to pass us, my sister hits the gas and swerves into it. Amazingly, we didn't actually hit it. The other driver had insane reflexes and swerved us around, and didn't even honk or stop. My sister instantly started to freak out and said she didn't see it. I was confused. I told her what she told me, but she had no memory of saying that. She then burst into tears saying she didn't see it, and she didn't say that. But my brother in the backseat confirmed we both heard her say it. To this day we don't know what happened, but she claims she didn't say that, nor see the other car. One time, I was over at my friend's house with a small group of about 3, as I was planning to stay over the weekend, so I packed a lot. It was around 10 p.m. when we decided to order pizza and watch some movies, and all of a sudden the letterbox in his door starts flapping, and we all thought it was the wind and shrugged it off. The pizza came at around 10:30 p.m. and tuck in. Then the letterbox went again. I had enough and checked and opened the door. There was no one there, and worst of all, no wind, which really creeped me and my friends out. We stayed up till 3 a.m., which was a bad mistake, as the letterbox started to flap more and more, and also harder. That's when I said, "Whoever is living in this house with us, flap the letterbox 3 more times." Hoping to not get a response, the letterbox flapped 3 times, and I started to get even more scared. That night, none of us got any sleep. Moral of the story: if you're planning to stay over a mate's house for a bit and something sounds off, check and rule out the possibilities, then you might be sure of it. In 2008, we renovated our house after buying it. We painted the cabinet doors in the kitchen and laid them out to dry. When it came time to hang them, 2 were missing. We searched everywhere but couldn't find them. I ordered replacements, but never got around to putting them up. We just got too used to the middle cabinets being shelves. About a year and a half go by, and I decided to paint the replacement doors and put them up. I painted them, then got busy at work and never got around to putting them up. Less than a year ago, I searched everywhere looking for the doors. I finally found them in the attic leaning across the access to a way that caused them to fall out of the attic when I opened the access. I cannot remember the last time I went into the attic before then. My wife can't even reach the access pull, so I know it couldn't have been her to put them up there. We've still not found the original doors, nor do we know how these got up there. Creepy. My wonderful wife worked in an assisted living home for many years. She became very close to her residents and was somehow connected to many of them. One Friday evening, we were at a restaurant having our date night dinner, and she suddenly straightened up, put her hand on her throat and said, "Oh no, John, no." I asked her what was wrong. "John, he just died." And then a moment later she said, "Oh no, don't do that. Let him go." I wrote down the time, consoled her and went home. She called work. John had died at the exact time she reacted, 10 miles away, and they had to perform CPR because he did not have a DNR order on file, and brought him back, breaking his sternum as usual, and he finally died in my wife's arms 2 days later. I had always wondered about my wife's psychic abilities. I have learned through the years not to question them, but this time was the first I ever got solid proof. She's a special lady, and I'm very lucky to have been married to her for 32 years. I just started working in a lab in August. Since I started, my co-workers have told me all sorts of paranormal activity that has happened. I listened to their stories, but never put much stock into it. One day, about 3 months into the job, it was late, and I was setting up a specimen and ended up staying behind as everyone else left. The hood I was using was in a corner, and I couldn't really see anything except what was right in front of me without turning my chair. Out of nowhere, I heard and felt footsteps rushing towards me. The lab is on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building, and the rest of the building is completely unoccupied, and a gust flew past me. I turned to look, and there was no one there. A few years ago, my sister was married to a soldier in the British Army, and he was stationed in Germany. We all visited her, and she knew I was interested in history. So for a day out, we visited Belsenbergen, the former Nazi concentration camp. As we were walking around, my sister was pushing the pram with my nephew in it. He was 1 or 2 years old at the time. The thing about Belsenbergen is that after the way it was burnt to the ground, it's more or less blank fields. As we walked, we passed a tree, when my nephew asked my sister who the kids were behind us. We all turn around, and no one's there. My sister asked, "Which kids?" And he replied, "The ones in pajamas." Yet again, no kids to be seen anywhere. We all knew for a fact that he had no idea what country he was in, yet alone know about the horrible events which had occurred in that camp. Big up Niam. I was going on a bus trip to visit my cousin, and the night before, I laid out my favorite toque to wear on the bus. I woke up next morning and it was gone, completely vanished without a trace. I don't have time for this, so I leave without it. So I'm at my cousin's 1,000 kilometers away, and we're playing on a Ouija board. I jokingly ask it where my thing is, and it says that it's in the basement. My basement is known to be a quite creepy place, and most people get bad vibes from it. So I'm talking to my mum on the phone, and I tell her what the Ouija board says. She goes down to the basement and asks for it back. And the next morning my mum wakes up, makes her bed, has a shower, and when she comes out of the shower, it's sitting there on the pillow. Is this ghost just really fashionable? My aunt raised me after my mother died, and for the last 4 years after her own death, I'm convinced she was trying to contact me. I've heard my name whispered in the middle of the night. I've been touched several times. I've woken up to find blankets that were folded up on the chair in my room to be placed over me. I've heard someone walking in my house when I'm alone, and my dog is cuddled next to me. Someone who was house-sitting asked if there was a blonde woman that lived near me, as they had seen her silently standing in the yard when they came to feed my pets. My aunt was blonde, but my neighbors are not. What needs to be understood is that it was very sudden and quick when my aunt passed. She was unconscious and drifting towards death before she even knew what was happening. We were also very codependent on each other, and we did everything together, lived together, watched TV together. She was my best friend, and I wasn't able to be there when she passed, as she died while I was on the way, and never got to say goodbye. Now, as I've seen so many horror movies before all this, it could be a demon trying to mess with my heartstrings and eat my soul. But who knows? Maybe she's just watching over me. I was on my dirt bike riding along some railroad tracks when I came across a tunnel and thought, hey, that looks like a good picture. I pulled out my phone and took some images. When I was done, I looked down the tunnel and I could see the other side, and thought I saw what appeared to be a little girl in a white dress walking towards me. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I waited a second, and that's when I heard a voice directly in my left ear whisper, "They hurt me." Let's just say I didn't know that dirt bikes would go that fast after that. The layout of my kitchen is very strange. Now, I was laying around on the couch just watching TV, and I hear this strapping sound, and next thing I know, a measuring cup was being thrown from the counter or fridge. I stood up so fast, and a wave of fear came over me and I nearly cried. No one was in the house with me except my dogs, a very old Chihuahua, and she never leaves her dog bed, and the other is a husky that was lying next to me on the couch. The last one is a golden doodle. She barks at everything, and she was behind me, behind the couch. You know how a ball is thrown, right? That's how the measuring cup was thrown. I can't see the fridge from where I was sitting, and frankly, I don't even know where it came from. No windows or doors were open. It didn't just fall, and I swear on my damn life it was thrown. I don't even know what's going on. I was in basic training at Fort Knox, and we were on a very long road march when out of nowhere this beautiful yellow lab with no collar that looks exactly like my dog at home comes up to me and walks beside me, of all people, for a few minutes before running back into the woods. This was a big boost to me, because you need to finish the march as one of the requirements to graduate, and I was dragging ass due to stress fractures in my feet. I was able to finish, and we earned some phone time to call home, where my mum informed me they had to put down my dog. She was sick before I left, and they were hoping that she would hold on another week, but she just got too bad. When that dog came up to me, literally out of nowhere, there weren't any houses around for miles. One of the things her and I loved to do was to go on runs together, so I like to think she was coming to say one last goodbye. I grew up in a two-family house for the first 10 years of my life. My best friend lived upstairs, and after my family had sold our part of the house to another family and moved, I'd often visit him. One time when visiting, I saw the woman who bought our part of the house and currently lived there at the time. We made small talk, and when she asked me if I remembered seeing a woman in my room, I tell her no, and she tells me that my parents told her about me complaining about a woman in a white dress by my bed when I was a kid. According to her, my parents mentioned it when selling the house. She also tells me that her son is now seeing the same woman and that he's afraid of her. I disregard it and sleep uneasily that night. The next morning I ask my parents about it and they completely ignore it. They don't say if it's true or untrue, they just say nothing. I'm not sure to this day what happened, but I sure hope that the lady that lived in my old house was joking. I moved into a new house about a decade back. Apparently the last owners were really into the occult. I never met them personally, but they left a handful of little voodoo dolls pinned throughout with their heads up in the corners of the basement and other rooms. I spent the first night taking down as many as I could. Those things were a nightmare to come across in the dark. I think they had a rat skull or something in the doll. Anyway, it's not terribly supernatural, but the last one I took down was shaking like nuts, like it was blowing in a really strong wind. I didn't even touch that one, just pulled it down with pliers and threw it out, and had really bad nightmares from the next few days. And I'm not prone to dreams at all. One night, I had this rough dream where my friend came up to me hysterically about his dad being gone and was having a terrible time. It was one of those dreams that looked and felt real, but the moment you wake up, you realize it wasn't true. Fast forward a few hours later, and I was sitting next to the kid I dreamt about, in the same way we always did, before going out to football practice in the 105-degree heat. And for some reason, I turned to help and told him about the dream and described it thoroughly to him. And as I did so, with a stone-cold face, he said to me that today is the 10-year anniversary since his dad left his family. And up until that point, I'd never known anything about his father or when he left his family. It was creepy. A few months after my uncle ended his own life, I had a dream where he was talking to me on the phone. In the dream, he was telling me to tell his daughters that he loved them and that he missed them a lot, but he talked like he was away in the military rather than dead. I also kept hearing weird clicking in the background. When I woke up, I mentioned everything to my mum, and she told me that when he was in the Navy he did Morse code. No one had ever told me that before or even mentioned it since I was alive. So it was weird that I remembered that part of the dream so clearly and made enough of an impression to mention it to my mum. My aunt, who was like my second mum, died suddenly when I was 3. Even though she was young, we were close, and I still remember her very well. A few years after she died, I was sleeping in my mum's bed and woke up for some reason. Lying across from me, I saw my aunt looking at me and smiling. I remember it so vividly. She had this white glow coming off her, and she was outlined in gold. It was amazing. I remember she gave me a hug and told me that it was going to be okay and to go back to sleep. It was so peaceful when I closed my eyes, and I woke up in the morning and she was gone. I told my mum, and she said Auntie probably paid me a visit. It was surreal. When I was 15, we had to put my cat down due to kidney failure. I still kept seeing him around the house for over a year after he passed. Some people might find some comfort in that, but it really creeped me out. I did not like it because I didn't believe in ghosts, but I kept seeing him on the back of the couch or sitting in a hallway, like I would look over and he'd be there, and then in the blink of an eye he'd be gone. I know the explanation is that it's just all in my head, because I'd seen him in those spots every day for 15 years, and it was just what my brain was expecting to see. And when we moved away, it finally stopped. My brother works at a theatre in Virginia, near a Civil War battle site, and all of the theatre employees claim to see a Civil War